Hello, and welcome to this video covering the most common styles of exam questions within the lipids topic. To get the most out of this video, I would suggest completing the lipids exam style questions worksheet in advance. So for our first question, this is simply asking you to describe the structure of this biological molecule. And I'm hoping that you might be able to spot that this is a fatty acid, and you can tell that from the fact that we have a carbon chain surrounded by hydrogens, and then at one end we have a carboxylic acid group or a carboxyl group. So we can establish that this is definitely a fatty acid, but this is a 3-mark question. So to access those 3 marks, we need to be saying a little bit more. And you can see that within the molecule we have 2 carbon-carbon double bonds. That makes this an unsaturated fatty acid, and because there are more than one of them, we can say that it is a polyunsaturated fatty acid to get our 3 marks. And then for the second part of the question, it asks you whether the double bonds are cis or trans, and we need to look at the hydrogen atoms on either side of the carbon-carbon double bond. And in this case, our hydrogen atoms are on opposite sides of the double bond, and therefore we can say that it is a trans bond because, and it's important to explain, so this is an explain question for 2 marks, so you did have to explain your reasoning for the second mark. So because the hydrogen atoms are on opposite sides of the carbon-carbon double bond, that makes it trans. If it was cis, they would be on the same side. So for the third part of this question, it simply asks you to describe how this fatty acid would combine with other molecules to form a triglyceride. And there are 4 marks available for this one, so you do need to be including quite a bit of detail in your answer. And you need to describe the structure of the molecule and then also how the bonds form within that molecule. So starting simply with glycerol plus 3 fatty acids. The question did start with 1 fatty acid, so you might have written adding 2 additional fatty acids here. And then we have our 3 ester bonds that form. So really important that you include the name of the bond and where they form, so between the glycerol and the fatty acids. And we have 3 condensation reactions happening here. And all of those condensation reactions include the loss of water. So you might have added that into your answer as well. So for our second question, we have one relating to the food test, and in this case, it is the test for lipids. Now, they have not given you in this question the name of the test, so you do need to include that within your answer, and that is the emulsion test. And in this question, the student has used crisps, which is a solid food sample. So you would need to crush that food sample, for example, in a pestle and mortar before you started your experiment. Then you need to state the particular processes within the emulsion test, and for this one the order is really crucial. So you can see on the mark scheme it's stipulating that you do include that correct order. So you would add your ethanol and then you would shake really well in order to dissolve any lipid in your sample in that ethanol, and then you would add your water. So that order is really important. You need to state your positive result, and in this case if lipid is present in the crisps you would expect a white or milky emulsion. But it is also really important whenever you're talking about any of the biochemical tests that you do include your negative result as well. So in this case, you would expect no emulsion if there was no lipid present. So question number 3 is essentially just a compare and contrast question, but they have broken it down into 2 different parts. And the first part asks you to state 2 similarities between the structure of triglycerides and phospholipids. So the mark scheme says they both contain glycerol, they both have ester bonds, they both contain fatty acids which can be saturated or unsaturated, and you do need to include that full phrasing for that one. And they both contain the elements carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. One thing to note about this is it is a list question, so you had point number 1 and point number 2, and it is really important that you pick your best 2 points and you separate them out into point number 1 and point number 2. If you were to include 2 correct answers in point number 1 and then an irrelevant or incorrect answer in point number 2, you would only score 1 mark. So it is really important for list questions to pick your best 2 points if it's a 2-mark question and separate them out into 1 and 2. So the second part of this question asks you to describe and explain 2 differences between the properties of triglycerides and phospholipids. Now there's quite a lot going on in this question. We need to both describe and explain. We need 2 differences, and we're looking this time at the properties rather than the structures of the molecules. But I have included the structures here because you do need to understand those structures before you can start to describe and explain the properties. So we have triglycerides, which have a glycerol molecule and 3 fatty acids, whereas our phospholipid molecule, it still has our glycerol, but we only have 2 fatty acids, and in this case we have a circle representing our phosphate group, which you would not find in your triglyceride. In my answer, I've used a table a little bit like I did with the carbohydrates contrast questions, just to make you make those direct comparisons. So if we start with the description, so for triglycerides, they are hydrophobic, whereas phospholipids have both hydrophobic and hydrophilic regions. And it is important that you state that they have both of those regions. And that would give you 1 mark for having made your description of that contrast. And then the second mark comes from your explanation. So the fact that you explain that the hydrophobic regions are due to the fatty acid chains, which are present in both, whereas the hydrophilic part of your phospholipid is due to the phosphate group, which is only present in the phospholipids. The second part of the mark scheme is for talking about monolayers, myceles or bilayers. You do not need to talk about all 3, you can pick one of these. And essentially phospholipids can form them, triglycerides can't. This is one reason why it's quite useful to use a table, because it's quite tempting just to ignore the fact that triglycerides don't do something. So it is useful to have a table in here to force that direct comparison. So you get 1 mark for having the direct comparison, and then your second mark is for your explanation. And in this case, the reason why phospholipids form those structures like bilayers is because they have both the hydrophilic bit and the hydrophobic section. And the hydrophilic phosphate heads point towards the water, the hydrophobic regions, which is the fatty acids, point away from the water, and that is your explanation. Okay, so that's where your 4 marks come from. I put a little exam tip in here. So if you do have these explain questions, look to be using words like because or due to, and that just highlights that you are making an explanation. Question number 4 is an evaluate the conclusion style question, and this is quite a common question style that does come up relatively often, so it is worth paying attention to the types of answers that we include here. In this particular question, a scientist has done an experiment looking for a link between saturated fat and LDL cholesterol levels. Now, you do not need to know anything specific about the link between LDL cholesterol and coronary heart disease for this particular question. All you need to do is to look at the data that you're given and say, does this data support the conclusion that the scientist has given? And in this case, the scientist has stated that if you increase saturated fat, that is directly responsible for an increase in LDL cholesterol levels. That is quite a big claim for that scientist to have made, and we need to evaluate it. Just a little exam tip here. When you are evaluating a conclusion, you do need to give arguments both in support and against the statement. You might not have a really balanced argument, so you might only have 1 point on one side and lots of points on the other side, but you do need to cover both sides of the arguments. On this mark scheme, we have only 1 point in support of the statement, and that is it appears on the graph that there is a positive correlation. So as saturated fat increases, LDL cholesterol levels do appear to increase, and there does appear to be a positive correlation. However, there are lots of points against the statement for this one. We only see a correlation, which is an association between 2 variables, but there is not a definite causation. So causation would be if a change in one variable actually caused a change in the other variable, and we cannot see that from the data we're given. And it might be that there is another factor involved. Now, you can just state it is another factor, but it is much better to include a specific example of what that factor might be. So genetic factors might be involved in LDL cholesterol levels. Also, if someone's eating a lot of saturated fat, it might be that there are other dietary factors. So for example, a lot of saturated fat consumption, they might also be eating a lot of processed foods. And it might be the processed foods that are linked to the LDL levels. So definitely state there might be another factor. If you can give an example, definitely include one. We've also got a relatively small sample size here. So we've only got 10 people studied, and that's not really sufficient to give us a representative sample. Additionally, there is no statistical test. So we haven't seen any evidence that the scientist has done a statistical test. Therefore, they cannot tell if that correlation that it appears to be is statistically significant. So just a reminder for this kind of question, really important to give answers both in support and against the statement. And do take note of some of those general points because they can be applicable to questions in other parts of the syllabus. So things like correlation, causation, other factors involved, sample size, and has the scientist done a statistical test? So that is the end of this exam style question video in which we've covered the most common question styles within the lipids topic. If you would like to find out any more about phospholipids, you can look at the membrane structure videos within the cells topic. And in our next series of videos, we will be covering the structure and function of proteins and enzymes.